I'm particularly pleased to welcome you all to this seminar series tonight. This is Antonio Andreoni. I'm an associate professor at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. We are hosting this seminar series with tonight Professor Damaris Coffman. We are particularly pleased to have her today for this seminar. Damaris is a professor in the Bartlett School of Construction and Project Management. He's also director of the department, and she has been working over several years on a number of important topics like infrastructure economics, climate change economics, climate finance, economic and financial history, and history of economic thought. Before joining UCL, Damaris was for a long period of time working and directing a center in Newnham College at University of Cambridge. And actually, she's also one of the managing editor of Structural Change and Economic Dynamics, where the paper that she will present has been recently published. So we are particularly pleased to have her tonight. As usual, we are going to give our speaker around 35-40 minutes for the presentation, and Georgos Gouzilis from our Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose tonight is going to be our discussant. So we will be following the Q&A with all of you who are involved in this. As usual, we will invite people who want to raise questions to either put their question in the chat or to raise your hand, and I will be inviting you to join the panel in the podium, so we will be able to see and hear you asking the question, posing the question to Damaris. Okay, without further ado, thanks a lot, Damaris, again for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Antonio. And I guess what I would actually say is that this has been a long time in the making. And in terms of the origins of the talk, I don't know if Marianne is here, but I wanted to thank her directly for suggesting this first in a Bartlett Away Day in 2017, when we were talking about her work on rethinking value, and particularly the relationship between value and rent. And she had said, "Oh, can you come and give a talk about Ricardo and Straffa and Marx and the concept of economic rent?" And I said, "Well, actually, I'd probably really rather talk about French physiocrats and Quesnay. I have this paper from 2012 I could dust off," and that's where we left it. And I guess it's been a dividend of the COVID crisis that I was able to dust it off in September, well, really August, September, along with a translation of an essay that Luigi Passanetti had written about Quesnay's Tableau, and to publish that in Structural Change and Economic Dynamics for a tribute issue to Passanetti on his 90th birthday. And that led me to get back in touch with Marianne and say, actually, I would be very happy to present this to the IIPP Seminar Series. And I think there is an alternative approach to thinking about rent in Quesnay and the physiocrats as a whole, which really deserves elucidation and needs to be thought of in conjunction with the thinking about the uses of rent in other elements of classical political economy. And I think my main message today is that thinking about rent is bound up inextricably in thinking about the state, especially in including the optimal size of the state capacity, and state finance in the 18th century. So the people who were thinking about rent were also at the same time thinking about how to solve apparently insoluble problems in state finance, and thinking about what the state did, what it should do, and what the ideal capacities of the state should be. And I think particularly post-COVID-19, when we're coming up again to crises about fiscal capacity, crises about the remit of the state, the proper role of the state in the modern economy, whether we should have an entrepreneurial state, a facilitating state, or the neoliberal state that's hands-off, it really is important to go back and to dust off the debates about this in 18th century France in order to really understand how some of these economic ideas have trickled down through the centuries. So, for those of you who are not familiar with the Tableau conomique, this is often billed as the first input-output table. I think that is a particular reading of the Tableau. Other readings are possible, but in any case, Francois Quesnay, who is on the left, was a court physician in the court of Louis XV, and upon the death of Louis XV, he really kind of repurposes himself within the French court as a thinker on policy, particularly fiscal policy, and eventually is described as one of the first economists or economists. But he was trained initially as a physician, and I think that training, in terms of the way in which he thinks about systemic interest within an economy and the way he thinks about the circular flows within the economy, do bear a resemblance to the way some physicians thought about the circulation of blood. That's been commented upon in the secondary literature, but he becomes interested in general policy after the mid 1750s. And he first formulated his tableau at the end of the 1750s. And then for about 10 years, it was circulated mostly in manuscript form, published in print form to a very close circle. And then eventually in 1766, he publishes it in one of the journals of the Philosophes, the Journal of Agriculture, Commerce, and Finance, which really gets it into the open. He worked very closely with Dupont de Nemours and Mirabeau to elucidate these ideas even further. They became known as the physiocrats, the French physiocrats, and they were in close correspondence with those in Britain who were sympathetic with their ideas. But that is the immediate context for the tableau. The wider political context, of course, is in the context of 18th century France. What we see is a significant step change in the cost and scale of warfare. And this particular portrait from 1712 hints at that, but without going into details or rehearsing in tremendous detail the size and a number of these armies, you do see a step change, an order of magnitude change, not only in the scale of conflict in continental Europe, but also the scale of the colonial commitments of the British, the French, and the Spanish in the New World. So the question then becomes how to finance the state, how to pay for all of that military expenditure, because the model of medieval Europe, where you had noble armies that it was the responsibility of nobles to raise and nobles to pay for and nobles to lead on behalf of their king, had given way to mercenary armies that were extremely expensive. And by the 18th century, this was putting significant pressure on the finances of all the European states. So in terms of the immediate context for Quesnay and the physiocrats, I think it is worth thinking a bit about Ancien Regime France. Just to put this in context for everyone, the Mississippi Scheme, which was led by John Law in 1719 to 1720, tried to effectively reform French state finance, by taking the mint, the indirect taxes, which are the excise, the direct taxes, which are the land taxes, and the sale of offices under one umbrella, and to harness that to a project to colonize Louisiana, eventually purchased by the United States, obviously in the 19th century. And this became the Mississippi Company. And the Mississippi Scheme's attempts to restructure state finance by bringing all of this under an umbrella and effectively taking over the French public debt collapsed in 1721, which then led to a period where things went very much in reverse. And French state finances effectively were privatized. Tax farming reemerged as a dominant mode of state finance. The other thing that reemerged as a dominant mode of state finance was selling noble offices in order to raise money. And the result of this was that the regent, who was ruling in favor of Louis XV after the death of Louis XIV, began to rely heavily on financiers, both the tax farmers themselves and those who were syndicating loans made on the back of tax farming. So what this effectively did was mortgage the revenues for years and years in advance, because the tax farmers would make advances to the king in exchange for ever longer leases on the French taxes. And what happened with tax farming is that you would have a particular tax in a particular area over particular items, say for instance, salt or corn or wheat, for instance, and a tax farmer would win the right to collect that tax on behalf of the king for a period of years and would pay in advance and then pay periodic rental payments to the king in order to hold that farm of the revenues. Now, this was very expensive for the crown because the farmers always made significantly more money on these farms than they had to advance to the king. On top of that, their rental payments were contracted at periodic intervals, and other financiers would make loans to the king on the back of those. So crown finances got to be very heavily mortgaged, and this was something that Quesnay could see in the court was causing real financial problems for the king. And at the same time, what they saw was a kind of miniaturized version of this, because large landowners, the so-called seigneurs, would also engage in something called fiscal manorialism, which is that all of the hereditary rights associated with their landowning, like a mill tax or the insistence that peasants perform labor, the corvée or the tail on their lands, they could monetize. They could turn into taxes that the peasants had to pay to the noble landowner, and those could also be mortgaged to tax farmers. So tax farmers were happy not only to collect taxes on behalf of the king, but they were also happy to collect taxes on behalf of landowners from the peasants. So the peasants were having to pay noble landowners, even as French crown taxes were being mortgaged to tax farmers. So all of this, Quesnay could see, was putting a lot of stress on Louis XVI and his ministers. And this was also against the backdrop where the obligations of the so-called nobles of the sword, the old nobility that had led noble armies, and the so-called nobles of the robe, who were the new nobles, those who were perhaps judges and administrators of this new French empire, were also accelerating. So Quesnay became very interested to understand how the French economy worked in order to reform the tax system. And also, I think, which is worth pointing out, that this is a comparative political economy, because many, like Montesquieu, who was writing a little bit earlier, became aware that you could make formal comparisons between France and Britain, or France and Spain, other polities in Europe, and to try to learn from those comparisons. So again, the main challenge was how to fund an increasingly expensive fiscal military state. And Quesnay's Tableau was built around the question of how to do that. And in order to do that, you had to understand the flows within the economy in order to understand how to best tap those flows, which is what Quesnay was aiming to do. Now, again, what I want to point out in terms of the polemics in the time, I mean, these are cartoons that are taken really from the 1780s, but there was an appreciation that the venality of tax farmers and the brutality of the system was forcing the French peasantry to the breaking point, and also greatly offending the artisanal workers who were engaged in cottage manufacturing. So there was a sense that this was putting France on a high road to revolution long before the revolution actually happened. So, Quesnay really did feel that there was a crisis here that his tableau was meant to help think about how to resolve. So I want to put that out there. This is a crisis of the state, much like the crisis of the state that we're rapidly facing today. So another historical context, which I think, again, is important to recognize, is that this was a so-called Republic of Letters. The people in France corresponded with people in England, particularly Adam Smith and David Hume. They also corresponded with Cameralists in Prussia and in Austria. There was a sense in which these ideas were hashed out amongst these different writers. I think also, if you become interested in this body of material, you'll see that Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations mirrors Turgot's Treatise on Taxation, which also mirrors a treatise on taxation by William Petty, which was written 100 years earlier. So these people are engaging with each other's ideas, both living contemporaries and also classical texts by people who had written decades before. And they were actually surprisingly well aware, perhaps more so than many historians have been until relatively recently, about the differences in their fiscal systems, their land ownership regimes, and their agriculture and industrial organizations. So they knew that British agriculture and French agriculture weren't organized quite the same way. They were also very well aware of differing rates of agricultural productivity in Britain and France. And again, one of the issues that Quesnay is facing is, to what extent does the organization of taxation perhaps impair agricultural productivity? But that's a rather secondary issue to him, to the question of how to design an optimal tax system that was most congruent with what almost all of these people regarded as natural laws or the kind of natural order. And again, the thing to emphasize is that most of these writers are deists, and they see a natural order, and they see the purpose of economic policy to design a kind of government of nature that's aligned with that natural order. So in that sense, his background as a physician, but also the fact that he is a deist, makes his intellectual milieu very different from some of the people in the 20th century who were libertarians, who kind of took bits and pieces of this literature to make arguments for free markets. That's not the world that they're inhabiting at all. What they're saying is that if you get economic policy right and you align it with what they see as a natural order, then you can have an effective government of nature. But they certainly are not advocates of laissez-faire or free enterprise by any means. But what's also evident in the writings is they are indeed very well aware that France is lagging behind Britain with respect to the growth of labor productivity in agriculture, and also with respect to non-agricultural populations. They're aware, although it's still relatively early in something that will see a real divergence in the 19th century, they are aware that British population is growing faster as well. So there is a concern about comparative tax systems, and they're trying to get to grips with that. But even so, again, the very specific challenges facing the French finances that Quesnay is attempting to grapple with, the biggest one is how to get rid of these tax farmers who were sucking the French state dry. And again, I think you can draw comparisons with the present because there are all sorts of forms of tax arbitrage and legal arbitrage that really does plunder the public purse at the expense of ordinary taxpayers. So you could almost see the tax farmers as equivalent to those large multinational corporations today that are engaging in various forms of tax and legal arbitrage. But at any rate, the tax farmers were one of the targets of Quesnay's reforms, and particularly of Turgot's reforms. His idea was that you could have a single tax and impost that would make it possible to suppress the farms and to transition to a more modern tax regime. But one of the issues, before you get to this question of a single impost, was to get a kind of mix of indirect taxation. So taxation on, say, salt or wheat versus direct taxation, which is taxation on land or individuals, correct. And in Britain, everybody was obsessed with this because in Britain, there was a very big concern that if you taxed, say, beer or ale, that you might be increasing the tax of beer and ale, either for ordinary people who were buying beer and ale, or you might be decreasing the price of wheat or malt that went into making beer and ale, and therefore creating a tax burden on landowners rather than on the producers of the beer and ale. So the idea was that the taxes might not fall, indirect taxes on goods that are manufactured might not actually fall on the manufacturers. They might get shifted backwards to the people who were landowners, or they might get shifted forward onto final purchasers, and that would create unexpected consequences of taxation. And again, one of the things that Quesnay is very interested to understand in the Tableau is these intersectorial interdependencies, so that you could see where the produce of the land, say malt and wheat, was going into manufacturing, and then how that was also producing goods that sustained the agricultural laborers, the manufacturing laborers, and even the proprietary classes. So this question of flows was very much built around this question of how to optimize taxation. There's a lot of concern about that in Britain, but again, for Quesnay, the question was to understand how these flows actually worked. And certainly in the British tradition, the interest in this microeconomics of taxation, this forward shifting and back shifting, becomes the theoretical basis for these ideas in the late 19th century and even in the 20th century. So this is where that kind of economic theory comes from. But I think what's also evident in Quesnay is this notion of a systemic interest, and that is that you can't develop a tax system that kills the agricultural sector or kills the manufacturing sector. You have to have a tax system that respects the fact that there are systemic interests as a whole that have to be balanced, and there are sectorial interdependencies. And what this tableau does is map at a very simple level what those sectorial interdependencies are, and make some recommendations about how to best accommodate that. The other thing that I think needs to be thought about here is that, Anati pointed this out in 1933, so it's not a new idea. But one clear message in all of the physiocratic writing is this notion that the proper object of taxation is that part of the national dividend, the surplus, which is necessary for the remuneration of the political class, while at the same time recognizing that the free part of the national dividend cannot be entirely appropriated by the state. So there is this idea that taxation pays for politics. It pays for military expenditure. It pays increasingly for judges. It pays increasingly for office holding of various sorts. And this, in the context of 18th century France, is a deliberate shift away from the assumption that noble office holders of various sorts would take these things on themselves. And it's also in contrast to how 18th century Frenchmen saw 18th century Britain, or 17th century Britain even, when you had justices of the peace and other gentlemen who were performing government effectively as their without being paid salaries as part of their role in society. And again, France is rapidly moving away from this because state capacity is increasing, and it's no longer either appropriate or practical to have noble office holders performing these roles. These are increasingly for salaried officials. And the question then is that taxation is to pay for all of this. And this is the first really formal articulation of that. But then if this is the proper role of taxation, what is the proper size of the state? And if the idea is to remunerate the political class, where do we get the money to do that? What part of the economy needs to stump up for this? And how do we reconcile those interdependencies and those systemic interests? So who should pay for the state apparatus and who should benefit become one of the key issues for Quesnay. So again, he's got this tableau which looks at circular flows in the economy, and it breaks the economy into three sectors. The productive class, which are those who are effectively either mining or engaging in farming and agriculture, whether pastoral or otherwise. They're creating materials which the so-called sterile class, which is the manufacturing or the industrial class, then uses to generate goods which the productive class needs in order to engage in their own activities, and which the proprietary class also consumes. And clearly the proprietary class, the landowners and the ruling class, is consuming the products of the productive class, but also consuming the products of the sterile class. So what is really revolutionary about this is breaking the economy into these three sectors and seeing the interdependencies amongst them, such that these groups are dependent upon each other, and that there is a systemic interest. Now, I think this is very different from the conception in Marx, where you have a sense of the exploitative capacity of capitalists and traditional landowning classes, but particularly capitalists vis-a-vis laborers. That's not the kind of vision of society that Quesnay is presenting. The vision of society that Quesnay is presenting is three mutually dependent sectors, and looking at the exchanges amongst them. Now, again, this is drawn in his Tableau conomique, and again, it's very difficult to read on this, but what he does is he follows those flows through the economy, and this is a circular economy. And there's also a very interesting range of economic literature which is developing around looking at the circular aspects of Quesnay, because he recognizes that you cannot deplete entirely those natural resources, and particularly today when we see the depletion of topsoil and the depletion of mineral resources, this concept of a tableau and whether it can be adapted to an economy that is circular, that does have an element of recycling and reuse, becomes an interesting use of this this document. But to explain it in more detail, again, you have this notion that there are these exchanges. And one thing that's also present in Quesnay, which is rather helpful in terms of understanding today how we got to thinking in terms of national accounting, thinking about accounting years, is that he does set up an accounting period by which you look at exchanges in the economy. And before the exchanges, he's got these three classes, and PowerPoint somehow distorted these figures a little bit, which are actually taken from the article that I published in SCED. But at any rate, he looks at it before the exchange, and then there is an exchange, and the various groups are left with their foodstuffs and their manufactured goods. The sterile class is obviously got its raw materials and the foodstuffs necessary to make the manufactured goods. And then the productive class ends up needing manufactured goods from the sterile class. and needs foodstuffs from from its own development, and then also needs raw materials, produces raw materials which the sterile class uses. It uses the foodstuffs, creates manufactured goods, which the productive class also consumes and the proprietary class consumes. So that question of interdependency is really the key message. And the issue then becomes, given these interdependencies, how do you design a system of taxation that doesn't disrupt the systemic interests and the intersectorial dynamics of it? So the notion then becomes, with Luigi Passanetti, who is a production economist who just turned 90 actually a couple months ago. He, as well as Leontief, who is one of the real founder of input-output economics, have argued that the tableau could be rewritten in the form of an input-output table. And if you do so that way, then what you begin to see is the nature of these interdependencies. The question of productive class, which produces foodstuffs and raw materials, the inputs and the outputs associated with them, the sterile class with its artisanal goods, which the productive class consumes, but also the luxury goods that are consumed by the proprietary class, the notion of a productive class producing items for the sterile class to consume, for the proprietary class to consume rather, and then the way in which this balances in an economy. And again, I think the question about what, clearly Leontief and those who developed modern input-output analysis were inspired by Quesnay. There is a reading of Quesnay that supports this, but the key thing to point out is that in the context of Quesnay's thinking about taxation, that maps very nicely onto the way in which the input-output tables depict these intersectorial dependencies. And I think what you can see is that then the means of production, the notion that the productive class is agricultural, the sterile class is manufacturing and artisanal, and the proprietary class is landowning and is meant to be involved in government, becomes associated with these as economic activities, but not in terms of sources of income. So the productive class has people who are laborers, but the productive class is not identified by the fact that they're laborers. It's identified by the fact that they're working in agriculture. Likewise, the sterile class is a mix of, cottage industry, cottage capitalism, and more factory types of organization. But the idea is that they're principally involved in manufacturing, either artisanal manufacturing or larger scale. And the proprietary class are those who are involved in ruling, whether they're people who are involved as salaried officials or whether they're people who are nobles who have hereditary offices that require them to provide hereditary functions. So that's Quesnay's way of thinking about it, which is again very different from Marx. But what he's trying to understand is the value add as a result of these economic activities and the way in which that's distributed within a society, and then what how that ends up perpetuating itself over time. So the Italian economist Luigi Passanetti, and again, one of the contributions in that article in Sked is that I translated from Italian his essay on Quesnay, which dates from the early 2000s, but he identifies essentially three primary postulates which are helpful for our own thinking about taxation and rent. One is this notion that the net produce of a nation lies in the surplus of physical goods produced in the primary sector, agriculture and mining, above those consumed in the manufacturing processes of the secondary sector, and of course by the proprietary class as well. Economic activity thus is a circular process which supplies all the goods consumed in production, such as the process that may continue unchanged in this flow. Manufacturing creates goods consumed as luxuries, culture, military expenditure, etc. So this is a model of the economy that didn't exist before Quesnay. The circular process is his contribution, and he sees kind of two time horizons. One, which is constructed, is a kind of finite accounting period, and then one is an infinite period by which these flows carry on over time. And again, if you develop a tax policy that disrupts these flows, then you're doing injustice, you're doing violence to the natural order effectively. But Quesnay also picks up on some secondary Passinetti picks up on some secondary postulates that are also worth talking about. One is this notion that capital is kept from one period in anticipation of the next production period, and is there for the purpose of savings. And it creates a formal construction then of cash flows and the flows of physical goods as symmetrical. Current money, therefore, currency is both a means of payment and a unit of account. And the relative price levels are not of interest. So whereas in the British physiocratic writings, the question is about the effect of a particular tax policy on the price of what is being taxed and on the price of intermediate goods. What is the interest here is on the value and how that value carries over into further accounting periods. There's also a close relationship in Quesnay between economic constraints and environmental constraints, and that is also worth emphasizing. And then there's this notion of the theoretical problem of rents vis the various classes and how that can be resolved. And then finally, there's this notion about this epistemological status, the relationship between economic theory and economic policy, and the idea of the deism and the government of nature behind it, where economic policy that attempts to design in contravention to what Quesnay sees as the demands of the circular system to keep perpetuating itself ultimately does violence to the whole. And again, this is not a libertarian position. This is a position that there are circular flows in the economy, there are sectorial interdependencies, and that if you design a policy that does violence to those, then you will end up hurting the entire economy. That's what he's arguing. What Quesnay is arguing, and that's what Passinetti chooses to emphasize. So to return to my main point about rent, I think to talk about how this problem of rent plays out in Quesnay, I think what we need to do briefly is just to review the idea that in classical political economy, there are three factors of production, and we still talk about those today, land, labor, and capital, though you can also talk about intangible capital. And this notion of economic rents as earnings above what is necessary to put each of those factors in production, that of course relates to notions of value, which many people, including Mariana, have picked up recently. But certainly in Quesnay, you also have that notion of economic rent, which there's a distinction between economic profit in modern theories of rent, which is earned, and economic rent, which is unearned. But I think in Quesnay, what you're really talking about more are the flows and then the surpluses and how you deal with those surpluses. And I think it would be worth pointing out that people often confuse concepts of economic rent and concepts of land rent in classical political economy. And this is partly because of the changing role of the landowner class that, in traditional, in traditional British political economy, the thing about landowners is that you have most of the freeholders in England who own land are not actively tilling their own land. They're not yeoman farmers. They let their land out to tenant farmers, and it's the tenant farmers who pay them rent, but who earn profits on the produce that they produce. And they may also use agricultural laborers to produce that produce on which they earn profits. It's those same landowners who rent out less tillable land to manufacturers who make the first manufacturing factories at large scale, who earn profits and employ laborers to manufacture products for them. So that concept of a landowner who is charging tenants, and the tenants are either capitalists who are engaging in manufacturing or tenant farmers who are engaging in agriculture to bring agriculture to market, perhaps using laborers, that's tended to confuse land rent and economic rent for students. And again, in the French case, I think it doesn't map exactly, but the important thing to understand is that this proprietary class is changing over the course of the 18th century. And whereas before, noble landowners tended to have significant obligations that came with their noble landowning and their noble offices, by the 18th century, they largely do not. they're largely able to monetize the obligations that peasants have to them, and often don't have these traditional obligations to the state. So what they are seeing is earning economic rent, because this is not earned profit. And on the other hand, it's also often not got any kind of attendant obligations, which it would have done in the past. And it then becomes a question of how can the state tap into that in order to fund this increasing state apparatus of salaried officials who do the things that the noble office holders used to do. And that is the moment in which Quesnay is contending with this. So what does the Tableau offer a new way of thinking about rent? This question of associating classes with their economic activities rather than their sources of income, the economic activities, and assigning these three classes, creating these three classes and mapping their interdependencies, mapping the extents to which they produce goods that are consumed by the others, and how this creates a circular flow, then becomes the question, then becomes possible to answer, okay, if that's how the economy works, then how do we best design taxation that allows us to fund government, to fund a proprietary class of salaried officials, as well as that old proprietary class of noble landowners who are just earning economic rents. And then it becomes possible to argue that taxation should focus on stocks rather than on flows, because you don't want to disrupt those flows. And that's why he comes to the conclusion that taxation should be focused on the so-called productive, on agriculture rather than on manufacturing, which is very different from the obsession in neoclassical economics about taxation distorting market prices, therefore thinking about VAT or excise taxation or income taxes in terms of their effects on the market. Does it all pass through to wages in a general equilibrium model, or does it, in a new Keynesian model, create frictions? And I think what's interesting about the Tableau is that, by creating these three classes and thinking about their interdependencies and thinking about the changing nature of the proprietary class, it really focuses attention on what in the economy creates value, and how are these items of value consumed by other parts of the economy. So focusing a discussion on value versus a discussion of price, which is what I meant to say, that this refocused discussion on value, rather than thinking about policy simply in the way that they might affect the prices paid, and therefore affect individual sectors within the economy. But again, in my view, and this is what I really want to emphasize, and I have tried to speed this up in a way that allows me to come in under the general time limit, is that this comes back to thinking about the role and the size of the state in the modern economy. Because in order to make a judgment about taxation, you also have to make a judgment about the requirements for the proprietary class, for the state and civil servants and officials who form the state's payroll. And once you do that, then it becomes possible to think again about how taxation should fall. But I think that it's interesting that however you draw out a concept of rent from Quesnay, you have to go back to a moment where this was a really acute issue in the 18th century. Who creates value? Who consumes items of value created by one class? How do these flows work? And how do you design a system of taxation that can meet the costs of government without destroying systemic interests and without destroying intersectorial dependencies, rather than simply, as in the British case, rewarding one special interest group or the other, which is effectively what happened in the factional politics of 18th century Britain. So I think that's where I'll end. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Damaris. This was a fascinating talk, and I'm sure many of the people in the audience have lots of food for reference to other line of research. I mean, I find striking the modernity of some of these issues in with reference to value chain type of analysis, or what happens in many sectors in developing countries in terms of the extent to which the sector interdependencies develop or not develop as a result of number of rents positioned from a systemic point of view. Georgos is going to be our discussant, and again, everyone later after Georgos will be able to join the panel for raising questions, comments, and so on. Georgos, I pass the word to you.
Great, thanks, Antonio. And thank you so much, Damaris, for this very interesting presentation. Let me pick up a few things I think are quite important and a few points I would like to hear a bit more about. First, I think you made an excellent work to present us the importance of Quesnay's contribution in the Tableau economique. How is the first model for circular economy, how it attempts to capture value added and flows of income through different sectors, and how different classes capture and create value at different stages of production, which is of course a very revolutionary thing, even from a national accounting perspective at the time. The important policy implications you highlighted very nicely is the issue of taxation in Quesnay and in Passinetti's reading of Quesnay, this distinction between the mainstream notion of optimal taxation, looking just at the tax rate, how that will affect prices and who will take the burden of this increase in prices, versus taxing actual rents, looking at what is productive and unproductive activity and taxing specifically unproductive activities in order to maximize the productive activities, which includes a notion of justice inherently. It's a distinction between equality and equity underlying in there, I believe. But most importantly, I would say that it's really interesting that the physiocrats in Quesnay had an understanding of the economy as a system, as a whole. But of course, we need to decrease rents, we need to tax rents in a very careful way to decrease them. But at the same time, we should be aware of the overall stability of the system. Just aggressively taxing rents to restore justice, however you want to define that in society, should include the ideas about the systemic stability and how that will affect the system as a whole. So based on that, I would like to raise three points which are related to Quesnay's Tableau economique and of course Passinetti's reading of Quesnay. First is about the notion of class and rents in this one. I mean, in the Tableau economique is created of the stereo class, sort of the capital owns, entrepreneurs, and the working class. I'm quite skeptic whether this is strictly relevant in our time, in the sense that rents are earned and captured by different social classes nowadays. We don't have a single rentier class as may it have been in the past with the landowners. Different assets are owned by a diverse range of social groups and people, so which is also evident in the top incomes literature. Milanovitz, Piketty point out that the top 1% nowadays is primarily wage income rather than profit or renting, which is it's an interesting thing to think about, whether there is strictly defined a rentier class as in the physiocrats. The second thing is about the purpose of taxation. Of course, taxing rents and distinguishing between the mainstream notion of optimal taxation and the physiocrats' idea of taxing specifically unproductive activities is interesting. But what about the structure of the economy itself? Would just taxing rents be enough? Or one needs to go specifically in specific sectors and firms that manage to capture rents throughout the process of production and change the institutions, the rent capturing model of certain sectors or the economy. And my final point is a more applied one. So the physiocrats, the inspiration of the physiocrats in historical discussion you presented to us was about this transition from a monarchy state to the modern state. I think it's fascinating with the reference mainly to advanced economies. I would like to hear a bit more if you think it's relevant how that is comparable to the transition of developing economies from colonialism to the current post-colonial states they have. And in terms of tackling rentiers in those economies, how that relates to tax havens and the rise of multinational corporations in them. Is it applicable to use a version of an input-output table inspired by Tableau conomique to capture domestic production process rent capturing in a very open economy which is dominated by multinational corporations? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Georgios. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Please, yes, of course. Before we open the floor to further questions, you have time to address these important points.
Yeah. Oh no, thank you very much. Those are very helpful comments and very interesting comments. I think in order to take up the first comment about the notion that there is no single class of rentier, I mean that is certainly true today. And but I thought, you know, this question of detachment from previous types of economic activity, that's definitely true. I mean, the number of landowners who are large-scale rentiers in the British economy, okay, I mean, obviously you've got the Dukes of Westminster and Grosvenor who, you know, get freehold income from large parts of central London and, you know, and the West End. But the reality is that most rentiers in the British economy are not those people. They are hedge fund managers, they are others. But in terms of the proportion of wage income and the top 1%, again, I think this is really a question of how you specify the problem. That sure, if you look at the top 5% or the top 1%, salaried income makes up a big proportion of sources of wealth. And I mean, you know, I guess I would put UCL professors in the same category, right? I mean, we're on the top 1 or 2% of you know, income in the UK, and most of us, our income is our way, you know, our salary is not private income. But when you talk about the super wealthy, when you talk about the top 1/10 of 1%, or you know, 1/100th of 1%, then you really are talking about people who have acquired wealth in ways that first and foremost are associated with tax arbitrage and with legal arbitrage, and have done so on a global playing field. And I think there the question is not, are we focusing the wrong things? But that really comes back to this third question about, can we talk about modern states in a globalized world? You know, what is the capacity of modern states to tax these people at all reliably? And if modern states can't do it, then what kind of alternatives should we have in terms of global governance? And I think that is a question that's much more important than whether the top 1% or 2% or 5% get most of their income from, you know, wages and salaries versus private income like second homes. It's really a question of how do you get the super wealthy, you know, in your tax net, given the number of opportunities to avoid taxation through global movement of capital. But it is a valid point. I mean, it does raise questions about how far you could think about national tax policies at all in isolation. In terms of the structure of the economy, I mean, Quesnay was not saying just tax rents. What Quesnay was saying is the taxes should fall on, you know, the agricultural sector, and that would have the effect of both taxing rents, but also taxing the economy in a way that did less violence to the system as a whole than taxes on other aspects on manufacturing. But I think that concept of an impost, which is taken up by Turgot, is sort of more along the lines of what Georgios was alluding to. And again, this is, I mean, it's not necessarily a question of a direct analogy, but simply to say that I think we spend too much time still thinking about the microeconomics of taxation, about how taxation creates incentives and disincentives, and don't spend enough time thinking about how to tax things that create value versus things that are effectively unproductive in terms of value creation. And that was my reason for focusing on this. I agree with you that the structure of the economy is very different. But I think that as we think more and more about circular economies and become more and more concerned about the depletion of natural resources, we need to start thinking a bit more about the structural implications of taxation and less about the microeconomic incentives associated with taxation. And that was really the key point I wanted to make. But I do absolutely come back to the idea that in a globalized world, the modern state is rapidly at least in terms of matters of coordination of international taxation, rapidly losing its status as the master noun. And of course, there's been a pushback to that as well in terms of politics of deglobalization. But it probably isn't entirely soluble without state actors working together. I think for developing economies, it is true that some developing economies have these more traditional sectors of the economy that are that look more like pre-industrial economies in terms of elites, landed elites in various locations having significant obligations to the state in exchange for collecting rents of various sorts. And again, some economies have found modernization to be the biggest priority. Some of these states have wanted to do away with these elements of the traditional economy. Others have wanted to find ways of working with them on the grounds that other stakeholders have found these regimes more benevolent than some of the alternatives. And I think I would really defer to individual development economists to comment on that. But I think this also very rapidly shades to questions about how far corruption is something that you want to tolerate in developing economies, and how do you stamp it out, and what are the costs of stamping it out in particular ways. Because if you looked back at 18th century France with the sale of noble offices and with tax farming, the first word you would apply to this is corruption. It looks like corruption as we understand it. And the question is, if that does exist within a particular economy, then, is your project the same project as that of Quesnay and Turgot to figure out ways of taming it and replacing it with something else? Or do you think of that as something that might support its own systemic interests? And if it does, what are the costs and benefits of keeping it versus retiring it? And I think I'll leave that there. But I absolutely agree with the speaker that in a globalized world, there are real coordination problems around tax policy. And those coordination problems amongst economies may increasingly be more profound, at least when you deal with the super rich and with multinational companies, than the coordination problems within an economy.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Demise. I think this was a very interesting exchange. I'm pleased that also the variety in terms of country context and how we understand rents in relation to rent seeking and corruption, and the role of productive corruption in the process of development comes up in the discussion. I think Gregor was the first one, Gregor Semieniuk was the first one to raise a question, a comment, and I invited him to the panel. Gregor, would you like to join the panel and ask a question? By the way, if you would like to open your video, it would be great so we can see you all as well.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes,
I don't see a button to video myself, so I'll just speak. Hi, I'm Gregor, joining from UMass Amherst on the US East Coast. Thank you very much, Dr. Coffman, for your presentation. I was really intrigued by your discussion about the distinction between land rents and economic rents. And the latter I typically encounter from a neoclassical subjective value perspective. And I would be really grateful if you could elaborate a little bit more how these economic rents would translate into the physiocrat model, which is, of course, by themselves conceived of based on a cost theory of value.
Yeah.
And also, and if I may still add, and also this struggle with the distinction between profits and rents, just conceptually in an only fledgling capitalist economy. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I mean, to take the first question, I wasn't suggesting that there is a notion of economic rent in Quesnay that maps to the discussions you're talking about, which really arise a half century and then full century, well, really a full century and more later. What I was suggesting is that what we recognize as economic rent and how you can apprehend in Quesnay's discussions about the optimal taxation, how to do that, because what he is talking, as you say, he's talking about costs, he's talking about productive value, and how that productive surplus, can be captured through taxation to be harnessed to the needs of the proprietary class to govern the state. And that is his focus. I absolutely agree with you. What I was suggesting is that his model does have helpful things to offer in terms of the way in which you think about rent, because you've got a sense of these various classes which are creating value, which is being consumed by other classes and is creating stocks that anticipate the next accounting period. And it is actually in those stocks and stores of surplus value that you have what later economists would break down variously into things like profits and rents. But those are, those that are created by the agricultural class, to him, are the most natural subject of taxation. And what we can see in this is a different way of thinking about economic rent. And I think that has also been the view that Passanetti has articulated at various times. I agree with you that what I was trying to suggest is that the tradition of economic rent versus land rent and the epistemological basis of that you see developing in classical political economy in the British context does have a different set of underlying assumptions. And I think you've pointed out what some of those assumptions are. And I think for Passanetti, this was a question of thinking, for him, marshaling that to attack what he saw as neoclassical assumptions about the price mechanism, which he then saw leading to marginalism, and how he saw exchange taking place in that literature versus the model that is evident in Quesnay. But I agree with you that in giving a lecture of this length, there was probably a little bit of slippage in the way I presented it in terms of our view of economic rent versus what you're talking about when you talk about rent in Quesnay and his contemporaries in their writings. So thank you for asking me to clarify that. The second point, I think, can you remind me again of what that was?
I don't want to take away everybody's time, but it was just about the distinction between profits and rents in the physiocrats in the first place, which was hard, I understand. Yeah,
well, I think that the question is there is a net produce associated with each of these sectors of the economy, and the normative judgments that are made in subsequent literature that are used to distinguish profit and rent is not there. But again, it's a question of to think about rent and profit is to think about income. And that is the interest in classical political economy from Smith to Marx. In Quesnay, you're not thinking about this in terms of income. What you're doing is thinking about this in terms of the product of these sectors of the economy versus the product of other sectors of the economy that are consumed in creating this product, right? And those circular flows. And the stocks, the surpluses that are stored for the next period could potentially by someone else be broken apart, but that's not Quesnay's intent. Quesnay does separately express views about the extent to which different kinds of surpluses accumulate, but his emphasis is not in the way that you're talking about breaking income down to profits versus rents.
Thank you so much for illuminating this. This is very interesting. Thanks.
Thanks, Gregor. I see one person with his hand raised from the beginning of the talk, so I'm not sure that this person would like to raise a question, but I'll allow him to be involved in the panel.
You mean me?
Yes. Would you like to raise any question, comments?
Well, just the view. We're not actually getting a view of each other, which makes things a little bit anonymous. It'd be quite nice if we could see each other. Is there some way of coping with that?
Well, I mean, I can turn on the camera, but I guess the main problem I was finding is that when everybody was talking, if I turned on the camera, it started to lag and voices became scratchy. So I turned it off to preserve bandwidth.
Right. I think we're operating with a webinar setting where you should be able to put on your video. If not, I'm sorry, it might not be possible with the Zoom setting we have at the moment. But if you would like to raise a question now, it would be brilliant.
Well, I've got nothing constructive to say, apart from to say thank you so much for a really thought-provoking presentation. I actually give a lecture every year at UCL on the Tableau conomique, and it doesn't really get, it's for first-year undergraduates, and it doesn't really get far beyond trying to get young people to do a zigzag of some kind that they can reproduce in an exam setting. But I was particularly interested by the way that this talk related the Tableau économique to the wider fiscal issues. And as I say, I don't really have much more to say about it than that I really look forward to reading this, and if I can incorporate some of it into my lecture in future, then I'll be very happy to do so. I get 200 students, over 200 students this year for my lecture on history of economic thought.
Thanks so much. Thanks for your testimony. I think it's critical to teach undergraduates concepts like sectoral interdependencies, fiscal, the role of the state in determining the market and the shape of the market. So it's great that there is some of that at UCL as well. Anyone else who would like to join the panel for raising? I don't see any other hand raised or also making some comments. If not, let me just use while people think about other questions. I think, Maris, what is very interesting is this issue around, as I was mentioning now, how you understand sectoral interdependencies. But of course, to understand interdependencies is critical to define what are the units of analysis that we are looking at in terms of the interdependence between what. And was wondering if you had some reflection to share with us about this issue in terms of how do we define the sectors and the productive activities related to these different classes from the Quesnay point of view, given that this is a quite controversial issue in economics, right, in terms of definition of sectoral boundaries and the nature of these sectors, and to a certain extent affect also how do we understand the flow and the sustainability at the systemic level between the different sectors that are interdependent. So I was wondering if you had some ideas to share around how do we think about interdependencies and sectoral interdependencies in the context of global value chains and more blurred sectoral boundaries determined by different type of technologies, digitalization, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, that opens up a really interesting conversation. And I think that it is important to consider that in Quesnay, he thought he was apprehending something that was real. It was not constructed. He saw a agricultural and extractive, part of the economy which he dubbed the primary sector, and then, the productive sector. And then he saw, the so-called sterile sector of activity, manufacturing or artisanal. And then he saw this proprietary sector, and he saw this as kind of in a deist way, the organization of nature, and he was simply identifying it and describing it. Whereas today, when we talk about an input-output table, I mean, yes, of course, these are constructed categories, and there are vast assumptions that labor behind them, and there are huge path dependencies once they are constructed, because everybody's interested in looking at data over time. And if you abolish some categories and create others, then you don't have the continuity of data that you would hope to have. And they are, in fact, snapshots of the moment in time in which they are created, and privilege some economies rather than others, and are more or less Eurocentric as a result of that, and do carry with them assumptions about linkages between sectors, even in the way in which the sectors are created. You're absolutely right about that. I don't think that for Quesnay, those issues were very salient. That wasn't what he was trying to describe, and he doesn't try to break the sectors down. I mean, you could try to break down his productive sector into, agriculture, into different types of agriculture, pastoral agriculture versus, cultivating agriculture versus mining. You could break mining down into some, mining of precious metals versus mining of non-precious metals quite profitably, actually. You could think about that in the 18th century, and there are other authors, particularly in the British case, do try to look at different aspects of this. And of course, even his sterile class, the interests of the manufacturers, who are artisanal cottage, laborers, are very different from the interests of the manufacturers who are engaging in what's increasingly factory organizations. So none of that really obtains for Quesnay, because again, that's not what he's not trying to drill down that deeply, because his main interest is elsewhere, and that is framing debates about taxation, to which he has already arrived at an answer. But in terms of the critiques of input-output tables and the assumptions behind them, which we see today, and even the fact that they effectively rely on a single accounting year in a kind of capital budgeting model, where you have the assumption of reconciliation at the end of that year. These are things that are all very valid concerns. I think the question is, if you aim to replace them or to evolve them or to make them more diverse, then you lose the comparability either, in terms of diachronic comparability of change over time or comparing different economies. And I'm not sure I have an answer to that, although, I would accept all of those critiques are valid. And also in terms of global value chains, I think that the long-running question about whether global value chains in a kind of Michael Porter world or the product of shifting factor endowments and what changes those factor endowments versus something that is very often created by international terms of trade, which are negotiated, through trading blocks and treaties and World Trade Organization rules. All of this is very live, and all of this needs, discussion. And I agree that it is possible that a kind of more technocratic input-output table occludes some of the politics behind this. I think it would be naive not to recognize that. On the other hand, I think it's equally difficult to just kind of accept modern neoclassical economics and to say that their firms, their households, and a national economy, and that nothing that lies in between is worth talking about. Because I think that it is, without a doubt, the case that if the state is going to extend the remit of its activities in the economy, either in terms of industrial policy or infrastructure policy, or policy on climate change and low carbon transition, that it is going to have to think about the interdependencies between industries and sectors, because the ramifications of not doing that are enormous. And likewise, that paper we had in Nature of Human Behavior in June about COVID, and magnification and application of COVID supply chain shocks in response to lockdowns. If these pandemics are going to become more common occurrences, then we absolutely have to think about, linkages in terms of understanding how these crises propagate through supply chains, because there are real injustices and inequalities in this. And to the extent that there is a politics behind it, that politics can be engaged with meaningfully. So I don't have any easy answers to that, Antonio. I think that's something that really affects all of us who work in this area. But I would hope that those of us who do input-output modeling of various descriptions are not naive about all of those assumptions that hover behind it. And I think also, as input-output modeling changes and becomes more spatially granulated, and perhaps also changes the time dimension of input-output modeling, and tries to harness things like big data, that conceptions of the ways in which industries are constantly changing and reconfiguring themselves, becomes more important. But I think we're some way off from formalizing that. And, I think that it's just important to make really explicit what these assumptions are and the baggage that it carries.
Thanks for your feedback. My quick reaction, it would open a long discussion, but it's interesting how people like Giacomo Beccattini, was another scholar alongside Pasinetti, who had been dealing with this more production paradigm, as Pasinetti would call it, wrote a book in the 60s where he was engaging with the concept of industry and the theory of value. I think was never translated. But he was actually trying to figure out, in that case, if we needed to update our concept of industry along a Marshallian industrial district line in order to understand processes of value creation in the context of agglomeration of activities. If you want, was the Krugman pre all the economies of agglomeration type of thinking. And in a sense, in that case, understanding the problem of the sectors through the lenses of spatial, if you want, economics or spatial agglomeration, the problem became, that potentially the commercial or the commodity-based definition of sectors, commercial categories do not help as well in understanding this type of sectoral interdependencies, which was, in fact, something that even Nathan Rosenberg raised in many of his articles around, the experience of development of the US in transforming the economy in the late 19th century, 20th century. He was very open in saying until we use classical classification of sectors, we might be unable to capture in that case, from his point of view, the learning technological spillover type of dynamics. I think Quesnay reminds us that also there is a political economy of that of course is critical in that respect.
I mean, I haven't actually. If you could send me that citation from Beccattini, I'd be keen to see it. My encounter with Beccattini actually was in graduate school because of his writings on industrial districts in modern Italy, and I read some of it at the time because he and Jonathan Steinberg were great friends. But I hadn't realized that A, he'd written that, and B, that it was out there but hadn't been translated. So I'd be very keen to have a look at it. I think that it's also. I mean, with Roberto Scazzieri and Ivano Cardinelli, we did that political economy of the Eurozone, which argues that the Eurozone is not just a monetary union, but also a unique polity that's a function of the economic interdependencies that develop as a result of monetary union. And there, I think, if there's one take-home message from that book, it's that you can't think about these economic interdependencies as simply existing within the boundaries of a nation state, but that they are cross-border and they fracture the economies of nation states and they cleave to the economies of other nation states, and that this creates challenges not just for the European Commission, but for everyone who's in that polity. So I think these are all things that need to be thought about. But I think the question about how far input-output methodology is a function, is a tool of production economics, and that any type of sectorial description that moves away from that invalidates the whole thing, is interesting. But it's, Beccattini and others were writing 50, 60 years ago, where it was perhaps neater and tidier to do that. I think when you start thinking about some of the newer sectors of the economy, it becomes very difficult to classify them in classic production economics terms. I mean, you probably spent more time thinking about this than I have, but I think, the so-called digital economy, it is very difficult to do that.
So I would invite you to put the video on just to say goodbye, and thank again Damaris for a fascinating talk, and Yorgos for providing such insightful perspectives and comments. Thanks everyone who joined and raised questions, animated the discussion.